Hey y'all, welcome to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Samantha Leighanne and I talk about books. Today is a fun day because it is episode 1 of my King Chronicles. And today we are going to be talking about Carrie. I read this at the very beginning of February. I did go through and do a lot of annotations. It was a reread. I read this for the first time when I was in high school and remember really liking it. I think that I enjoyed this book much more the second time around. Not that I didn't enjoy it the first, but I think being older and being a little bit more experienced as a reader and just as a person definitely kind of changed how I felt about this book. So today we are going to be talking about my thoughts on Carrie. This isn't necessarily going to be a review. There will be a lot of spoilers coming for this. So if you haven't read this book, I suggest you go read the synopsis on Goodreads and then come and watch this after you have read it. I wouldn't necessarily call this a video a review. I would more or less call it a discussion or an analyzation or something like that of this book. So it is going to be split into parts. I am kind of keeping my thoughts together in a notebook, and the way that I'm kind of splitting it is just basic facts about the book, what my thoughts are, including kind of the synopsis, and then some of the themes and motifs that we find throughout the text, going into some of the characters specifically, and then at the very end we'll talk connections. In the earlier works like Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Shining, there aren't really going to be a lot of connections, seeing these are some of the first, but we do see some of the inspiration and some of the beginnings of some things that kind of reoccur through Stephen King's body of work. So I will kind of touch on that as I see them. As always, these types of things, friends, are subjective, okay? I am talking about this book from my own personal viewpoint. I am not a scholar. I do not have a degree in these types of things. I am simply interpreting the text as I have read it. So that being said, if I put my interpretation out there and you happen to not agree, that's fine. I am not saying that anything that I put in these videos is 100% correct. I am not the authority on any of these things. This is just an author that I like. These are books that I like, so I'm talking about them. But obviously, if you have anything to add, if you would like to discuss, I love discussion, especially about this author and his work, so definitely leave some comments. So obviously today, since I've been already holding up this book for 5 minutes, we're talking about Carrie. Carrie was published on April 5th, 1974. I read this book in the span of about 4 days, and honestly, I probably could have read it in less than that time. However, I went through and did a lot of annotations for this book. This is obviously a classic horror novel. Pretty much everybody already knows that. And I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. So as far as facts go, this is actually the 4th novel that King wrote. It was just the first that was published. It began as a short story, just a way to earn some quick cash. He got a couple pages into it, threw it in the trash. His wife fished it out and was like, "You have something more than you think that you are here." And history is made. One of the things that I love about this book is in the foreword, but he does talk about who Carrie White is kind of modeled after. And she's modeled after 2 girls that he went to high school with. And unfortunately, neither of them were alive at the time that this book was published, but he took aspects of both of these girls and pulled them into who became Carrie White. This book has also been one of the most frequently banned books of all time, so there's that. So a brief synopsis of this, we have Carrie White. She is a teenager. I believe that she is 17 years old. She's a junior or senior in high school. Forgive me for not being able to remember that exact thing. Carrie comes from an extremely religious household. She lives solely with her mother, who is, I don't want to say the town pariah, but she's known for being a little out there, extremely religious. And because of that, Carrie has lived kind of a sheltered life. She was made fun of most of her life. She has been an outcast all of her life. So we open the book in a locker room. In this girl's locker room, they're showering, they're getting ready to go to their next class. Well, Carrie White is also there. She is written to be not necessarily slow, but she's kind of like dreamy-eyed. So while she is in the shower, she starts her period. Well, because her mother is super religious and doesn't like to talk about things like that, she's never been taught that this is a thing. So Carrie thinks that she's bleeding to death and starts to panic. Well, the girls around her obviously think that it's hilarious and start throwing tampons at her and chanting things at her, and it just turns into a really ugly scene. So that was really kind of our first glimpse on what life has been like for Carrie for most of her life, especially whenever it comes to dealing with other people. This story as a whole really struck a chord with me in a lot of different ways. And I think that it really kind of shows what people can do whenever they're pushed to the edge. There were times where I was reading this, especially leading up to the infamous prom scene, where like my heart would just shatter, like when she was spending time with Tommy, and Tommy is probably the purest character in this entire book, but like my heart just shattered for her numerous times. This book in general was simple horror at its finest, but at the same time it definitely made you feel things as well. The recurring themes like sin and revenge and blood, which I'll talk about in a little bit more depth later, really kind of gave it depth, more depth than I was expecting it to have. And the foreshadowing that he kept writing into the plot really kind of kept things moving and really kept you turning pages like, okay, obviously something's gonna happen. I need to see what it is. It would be very hard for you to go into this book at this point not knowing the major plot points, but I think that the way that he writes really kind of lets you suspend your disbelief and really immerse yourself into the story. And I think that even though I knew the ending because I've seen the movie, I've read the book, I definitely felt compelled to keep turning the pages. There was this overall feeling of tension while building to the climax, and that had everything to do with the structure and the way that it was written. And I think one of the reasons that it was so compelling was because of the format that it was written in, and that had a lot to do with the inclusion of like newspaper articles and interviews and transcripts from court cases and things like that. So at that point you knew something horrific had happened, but you hadn't yet seen the event, and everything was done very vaguely so that it's like, okay, well, I need to know what happens now. Like I need to keep reading. Carrie herself I found to be an extremely sympathetic character. It was honestly kind of hard not to root for her because of the things that she went through and because of the life that she came from. So even though she's technically the villain in this book, at the end of the day, you're almost cheering for her in a way because she is just this tortured soul and she's been through so much in her young life. And I know that it sounds bad to say that, you know, like I would almost root for her, and I also think that her character contrasted against her overbearing mother made things really interesting. And Margaret White as a character I thought was brilliant, and I almost would have loved to have a book like solely devoted to her. Like I think that that would just be really interesting because this bitch is crazy. Even though whenever you look at aspects of this book, seeing it was written in the 70s, you know, there are parts of it that do seem a little bit dated. However, I think because of the themes, it's going to continue to stay relevant. And especially now, whenever we talk about bullying children and pushing kids to the edge and just some of the events that have happened in the last several years in schools, I think that it is going to continue to stay relevant. Not just as a piece of horror, but again, the social commentary that is littered through this is also very important, I think. You know, I think that at the end of the day, one of the things that this book really talks about is these are the consequences of what happens whenever you push someone too far. But I also think that it teaches us that kindness is a very important thing. However, when we are performing an act of kindness just to placate ourselves, sometimes that can do more harm than good. And now I'm tired of holding this book, so we're gonna put it up on the shelf over. So that was just kind of an overview and like what my general thoughts are on the subject. So now we're gonna talk about some of the themes and motifs that kind of weave their way through the story. The first one being sin. Obviously, I talked about how Margaret White is a very religious person. There are no mirrors in the home because of the sin of vanity. Margaret thought that any type of sex, premarital or marital, was sin, and therefore Carrie was conceived in sin. And I think that that in particular plays a very large role in what tormented Carrie so much, is that her mother is absolutely insane. And it's almost impossible for her to enjoy anything because Margaret seems to think that everything is a sin. And again, that torment also comes from she loves her mother. She has a desire to please her mother, but at the same time, she also has a need to be accepted by her peers, and those two worlds clash in such a very big way. And I think that that is one of the things that makes Carrie the most tormented. The next big theme that runs through this book is definitely the theme of revenge. And revenge is a huge destructive force in this novel. Had Chris not needed revenge for not being allowed to go to prom, Carrie wouldn't have taken her revenge after having pig's blood dumped on her. And Carrie doesn't take revenge on Chris Hargensen specifically. She takes revenge on the entire town. She takes revenge on all of the people that had always alienated her. You have another character, Billy Nolan, who helps Chris Hargensen take revenge on Carrie White, and Billy Nolan also wants revenge on her, but simply for no other reason than just for being a woman. We don't see him very much, but every thought that he has about women is terrible and hateful, and so he has no reason to hate Carrie, none whatsoever. He only hates her because she's a woman. And lastly, we have Margaret, her own mother, that needs revenge on Carrie because Carrie to her is the child of sin. Carrie was begotten in sin to Margaret, and the punishment that she gives Carrie is kind of like an extension of revenge to her for being a child of sin. And I think that it is also an extension of the revenge that she wishes that she could take on her husband who is no longer living. I think that it is just as much for Mr. White as it is for Carrie. And a lot of the events that are set in motion are solely due to the feelings of guilt. Desjardins comes down really hard on Chris Hargensen because of the guilt that she feels towards Carrie and Carrie's lack of understanding in that first opening scene in the locker room. Sue Snell is also another character who feels massive feelings of guilt. She is one of the characters who wouldn't necessarily have normally been drawn into things like that, but something about the locker room scene and that kind of like groupthink, so to speak, she got drawn in, and her feeling of guilt because of being drawn into that situation makes her forego her own prom and have Tommy invite Carrie to prom instead. And we all know how that turns out. And then again, we have Margaret White, and one of the reasons that she's terrible to Carrie is because of this feeling of guilt that she holds because of the night of lust that she shared with her husband that she thinks is disgusting and she actually enjoyed, that resulted in Carrie. And I think that a great point in this is that guilt is kind of a useless emotion when you really think about it. And honestly, guilt is not only a useless emotion, and sometimes it's better to just move on than to try and atone, because kind of the way that I see it, Sue, while her heart was kind of in the right place, I feel like she did do that more or less to make herself feel better. I feel like had she let the situation lie, that things would not have gone down quite the way that they did. So yes, guilt is a useless emotion, and sometimes trying to atone can result in things far worse than just letting things lie. And the last really big theme that I saw running through this book was definitely the theme of sexuality and kind of like feminism almost. Most of the characters in this book are conflicted about sex in some way. We have Margaret, obviously we've talked about numerous times that she is very conflicted when it comes to sex. Margaret can't seem to separate sex from sin. Carrie's telekinesis kind of presents itself, the transition between being a child and a woman, and that process that makes us as women able to conceive children. And we saw from the opening scene that Carrie didn't understand what was happening to her because Margaret can't even speak of this process because to her it is just so sinful. So again, sexuality is just something that everybody seems to be conflicted about. Then you have someone like Chris Hargensen that we see in a couple of different scenes with her and Billy, where Chris sees sex as a form of power. And then you have Sue that is kind of the direct opposite of Chris in that respect. So just a couple different notes on the different characters in the text. So obviously we have Carrie. She's such a tragic character and she's very alone. It's said time and time again, she really only wanted to be able to be a real member of society. There are several times where she says, "This is my last chance," to really become part of society as a whole. And she's just such a tormented soul. She's tormented by the religious upbringing that she had versus her need to be accepted by her peers and just be viewed as normal by society. Next we have Sue Snell. I do believe that her heart was in the right place whenever she set events into motion. She does seem to be slightly superficial and selfish, but to be fair, most people are. However, I think that in the aftermath of everything that happens, that she definitely changes, and you can kind of see that through some of the subsequent interviews. We have Margaret White, an insane religious fanatic. She's also tormented by her religion and by her inability to accept her sexuality for what it is. And like I said, there's only bits and pieces of her life that we get through the book, and I would really love to see a full-length novel for her because I just think that it would be ridiculously interesting. We have Chris Hargensen. Obviously she uses sex as a form of power. In general, she just seems to be kind of a terrible human being. And also, I think that we see that she never really had a chance, because there is a scene between the assistant principal or the principal and her father, and you can clearly see that Chris is everything that she is because of her parent. So then we have Tommy. Tommy, honestly, in my personal opinion, is probably the most pure character through this entire book. He is really self-aware and just aware in general, and he is brutally honest to a point. And honestly, I feel like that's one of the reasons that he was chosen to die. Like, even though he is a good character and you always want the good person to survive, I think that that was the reason that he didn't, because he's so pure of heart. Okay, so for the last section of this, there are connections. Again, this is his first novel, so you can't really see connections, right? But I did pick up on just a couple of things that I thought may be kind of the beginnings of certain ideas for King. So these are some of those ideas. So again, there are so many religious themes in this book, but I think that we kind of start to see maybe the beginning of the Man in Black. And the reason that I say that is, if you're familiar at all with the Dark Tower series, if you're familiar at all with many of his body of work, telekinesis and other powers like that, ESP, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of his work that have characters who have those kind of abilities. And Wolves of the Calling in particular, there is a plot point where children who have these types of abilities are being used for something in conjunction with the Man in Black. And honestly, given the religious themes in this book, and again, this could be 100% reaching, like I could very well be reaching. These are just like the things that I'm seeing. But when Margaret sends Carrie to the closet, we get this quote, and it's on page 59, my annotated edition. And it's, "The black man grinned at her with his jackal mouth and red eyes, knew all the secret of woman's blood." And again, this could be reaching, but I have never seen somebody who's going to go to pray to the Man in Black, but it could be kind of like the beginnings of an idea. Considering the name and the natures of evil and just the context that that's used in this book. So that was really the only thing that struck me in this book. And again, I could be reaching because of just the name, the Man in Black, but just, I don't know. Those are just my personal thoughts on it. Again, like, I'm not the authority. This is just my own interpretation. And I'm fully aware that if Mr. King himself probably watched this, he'd laugh hysterically, but I don't necessarily like mean that he came back to this and like developed it, but just like that idea was kind of always like rolling around in his head and kind of like came out in different ways. So there's that. But so anyway, that's all I have for this first edition of the King Chronicles, spotlighting Carrie. Have you read this book? How did you feel about it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Comment down below and let me know what you thought. Don't worry about keeping it spoiler free, because at this point, like, if you've been watching, you've read the book and you know the spoilers, so there's that. Okay, if you wish to discuss this any further, all of my social media links can be found in the down bar below. I look forward to talking to any of you that you wish to discuss. Again, if there are books of his that you would like to buddy read with me in the future, send me a quick message, comment down below, whatever you would like to do. As always, if you like what you see and you want to see more, make sure you give it a big thumbs up and hit subscribe if you have not already. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye.